Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon if you're on this side of the Tasman where I'm actually based at the moment. Let me just minimise that screen so I can see what's going on. Okay, welcome to the webinar today. I'm going to be speaking today on brooding. So I've tailored this presentation to cover PS and broilers, depending what generation you grow in. The principles are the same. It doesn't matter, it really matter. It's all about getting the birds off to a good start. There are a couple of little differences, but the bulk of it's the same, but you'll see where I highlight the differences. So let's talk about brooding, setting the chicks up for success. Okay, why is that? Okay, so what is brooding? Sorry, I just need to move this out of the way. So brooding is, what do we mean when we talk about brooding? So brooding allows us to provide the best possible start in life for the chicks we receive. And that means we're trying to get them off to a good start by stimulating and activating all those necessary bodily functions that they require to grow. But at the same time, we're also chasing body weight profiles or uniformity profiles to ensure that we're getting our birds off to the best start possible. So when we talk about the physiological development, there's a lot of things happening with the chicks when they get to us from the hatchery. They've got an underdeveloped or cardiovascular system, pulmonary, the gastrointestinal tract. We're trying to get the immune system kick-started. We're also starting to grow the skeleton and the muscles and the feather and helping them thermoregulate themselves. So there's a lot happening in those first 7 days that we are trying to get up and running at the same time as getting some growth on the birds. So the first 7 days, which for me is the brooding period, the first 7 days, a lot of the feed that we're giving the birds is being used for growth and not so much for maintenance. Now, I just wanted to, before I get into the principles of brooding, I just want to dig a little bit into gut development, because feeding is one of the most important parts of the brood. We're trying to get the birds to learn where the feed is, to eat the feed regularly, to drink water and to grow. So if we're trying to get the birds to eat, it's important that we're developing the gut, which is part of their eating process. So the gut is the largest organ in the body, and it is responsible, obviously, for the breakdown and absorption of the nutrients that we're giving the birds through the feed. It's also one of the most major interfaces between a bird's immune system and the environment. So it's important we do start the birds well so they can build a very strong gut wall, which will help them when they're faced with stresses, whether it's an environmental stress or a health challenge, a copsy challenge or something like that. If we don't get them off to a good start, and there are reasons why sometimes that won't happen, or if we have a good start, but then we have a bit of a stop-start process in those first few days while we're transitioning them onto our feed system, then we can potentially not only be slowing down the growth, but also affecting the gut growth and development. And a good healthy gut is very important for a good healthy chicken. So it's important we get that bird started well and we develop that gut so then it can resist and fight things when the challenges they face, and also give us efficient production. This is a slide from one of my colleagues in the UK, Richard Bailey, and he's done a lot of work on gut health and gut development, microbiota. And it's a great slide because it pretty much tells us what's happening when the chicks are hatched. So until we get them onto the water and the feed and clean water and have them in the correct environment, then we start to see things like the yolk sac will start to be absorbed, which is really important because there's a lot of maternal antibodies in there the chick needs. There's some good lipids they can be using. We'll see things like enzyme production. The gut tissue will start to mature and grow, and I'm going to just touch on that a little bit more in the next slide. The immunity starts to begin, and we're also developing that gut microbiota, which is going to hopefully help them absorb all those nutrients and use the feed as best as they can. So from a brooding point of view, I just want to, and this is something we can't see, but this is something we need to understand, is that when we're taking them through those first 7 to 10 days, one of the things that is happening is the villi growth in the intestine. Now, the villi are the little fingery parts of the intestine where the feed can get absorbed through the gut wall and into the bloodstream. Now, for the villi to start growing, there needs to be a presence of feed. So this is why it's important that we get them onto feed as soon as we can from the hatchery, and that we maintain that feeding through those first 7 to 10 days. What's happening in the first 7 to 10 days is that the villi length, among other things, is the villi is growing longer. And this means we're going to have a bigger surface area for the nutrients to pass through to the bird. So obviously the more surface area there is, the more nutrients will pass for growth. if we for some reason delay the start or have that stop start, or there's been a health challenge with our chicks when they arrived and they haven't started well, whatever's happened, if there's some reason why we haven't given them that good start, there's the potential the villi won't be as long as they possibly could. By the time we reach 10 days of age, the villi length has been determined, and what we are seeing now is just cell renewal. So again, very important what we're doing in those first 7 days to get the villi as strong and long as possible. And to see this, obviously we can't see the villi with the naked eye, but from a magnified photo, we can see some examples here of after 24 hours from hatch, and the birds have been on water and feed for 24 hours. The photo on the left-hand side here is with feed, and the photo on the right is without. So in the space of 24 hours on feed, you can see at the same magnification, you can see how much growth and development has happened in those villi in such a short period of time. If we want to look at it ourselves from the naked eye, we're obviously not going to see the villi, but we can look at things like the gut length, the gut strength, and the yolk sac, because this will kind of tell us how we started the birds as well. We've done trials over different times where we've taken chicks from a hatch, the same hatchery on the same hatch day from the same donor flock, brought them into a trial setup, and then we've put them in the same environment with the same light programs, but we've run them on different little trials. And one trial we've done is we've run birds on feed on arrival, birds on feed after day 1, and birds that still haven't had feed by day 2. What we can see here is just in 2 days, the length and the thickness of the intestine on a bird that was on feed from placement versus the length and thickness of the intestine that on a bird that hasn't had any feed. The other thing that's good is worth noting too is the yolk sac has started to be absorbed, where this one is still holding on to its yolk sac because it hasn't found a food source. So these are good ways that we can check if we've had a good start. We know that to get that bird chicken on feed from the beginning is vitally important to get them going. They will be times when you, like I said, you will have challenges where potentially they haven't travelled well. For the PS customers who are sitting on this webinar today, you know that when we send you birds, we're potentially sending them in a truck for 10, 12, 14 hours. They've been hatched for a while because we've had different processes to run through to get them counted and sexed and vaccinated and things like that. So a delayed start, it's not such a challenge that they may spend a little bit of time in the hatchery, but it's about how you've maintained them in that hatchery and then on the truck and then out into the field. Because once they hit you and they come out of the truck, we want them to hit the floor running. This is the same intestines of this one here, but what we're seeing now is pre-removing them from the bird. So not only can we see that the intestine is a lot thicker, there's feed in the intestine and the fragility, you know, this one's still quite fragile and thin, but we can also see just in 2 days how much bigger this bird has grown compared to this one. So we can see the skeleton has got bigger and the bird has got bigger itself. So getting them started is important, and then maintaining that start through those 7 days as well. Okay, so today I'm going to just talk about a few things in regards to brooding. I want to talk about the preparation and setup. I'm going to talk a bit about monitoring temperature, humidity, and CO2, and understanding temperature and humidity. And then I'll also talk about feed and water management, chick monitoring, and troubleshooting. So what went wrong and how can we identify it and try and repair it or correct it for next time. So brooding preparation, this shouldn't be new to anyone who's on the call, on the webinar. We should be preheating, obviously, after our shed and farms have been cleaned and we've sanitised and we've brought our new litter in. We should be preheating our sheds, and depending on the time of year, obviously in New Zealand at this time of year, 48 hours minimum. It's important that we heat that floor, but we also heat the structure of the building, so it does hold and maintain that temperature for when the chicks come in. Air temperature 30 degrees. I'll talk about this a bit more in a minute because I know there's a lot of people who are probably sitting here thinking that's too cold. Floor temperature, we're targeting 28 to 30 degrees. Relative humidity, ideally around 50 to 60%, and I'll get into that a bit more soon. Minimum ventilation needs to be running when the birds arrive. We're looking at a stocking density of 40 chicks per square metre. If you're in the PS operation, you're making up brood pens. So when you are making these pens up, make sure you know the floor area and then how many chicks are going to go inside them. For broilers, 40 chicks per square metre is roughly a half house brood. And the reason it's important to keep them close together for at least the first day is because they do like the comfort of having each other close by. Mum's not there to sit on them, or they can get underneath. And they also learn from each other initially when we place them. So we don't want to have them too far apart and not having that ability to watch each other and learn and see what they're doing. Light intensity, we have quite a bright light over the brood area in PS and a little bit lower in broilers. Paper cover, I'm going to get into that as well, but paper cover is very, very important because it's about having a lot of availability of feed for the chicks while they get going. Food and water on arrival and supplementary drinkers and feeders. None of this will be new to you all, but the thing we need to keep in mind with this setup is it's a perfect storm. You can't have the perfect air temperature and have a floor temperature of 25 degrees. The birds won't do well. You can't have a good floor temperature and air temperature, but not enough feed on the paper or not enough paper out. So it's important that we have all of these lined up together to get that best possible start for the chicks. Okay, here's a few tools that I'm sure you're all familiar with. For those of you in the PS rearing farms, you would hopefully have one of these in your cool toolkit. This is a Braun thermometer that we use to take vent temperatures for the chicks when they arrive. When they've had a long drive in a truck, it's important to know what condition they're coming off on. Your hatchery should also have one of these purely to monitor the chicks while they're in the holding area. A lux meter to measure the lights. Everyone's probably seen a Kestrel or something similar to double check your humidity, your temperature, your air speed. Your infrared thermometer for measuring your floor temperature. Now, keep in mind, this is an infrared thermometer that gives you a spot temperature. So it's going to give you the temperature of the object that you're pointing that laser light on. It's not going to give you an environmental temperature. So just be aware that I have been places where people are pointing at and says my temperature is 32, but it's actually the surface you're touching is 32, not your ear. What I like to see, broiler or breeder, I'd like to see some sort of thermometer, hygrometer, something that you can just pick up quite cheaply at Mitre 10 or Bunnings, something you can put in the brood area to monitor your controller. And I'll touch on that a little bit more as we go through. But it doesn't have to be super, super accurate like a Kestrel, but it just gives you an indication when you need to start double checking things. The last picture here is a CO2 meter, and any service people that are on the webinar today, you should have one of these in your toolkit, and I'll talk about the CO2 in a minute. But the best tools obviously are the ones you get for free and that are permanently attached to your body. I'm going to talk a bit about stockmanship through this presentation. You've got thousands of thermometers in your shed when you put your chicks in there, and they are the ones who will tell you what's going on. We need to make sure we are reading our birds and understanding what our birds, when they're comfortable and when they're not comfortable, and making those changes, because when we start to put our faith or all our decisions into a controller, then we're going to have challenges or issues. So, and this takes time, obviously. If you're new to the industry or new to the business, breeding the birds is something that you have to learn. But what we should be doing is when we walk in the shed and when we're brooding, we should be listening. Are the birds scurrying around when I open the door? Can I hear them tapping at the nipple? That sort of thing. If I can't hear any noise, then straight away I start to think that the birds aren't active, so we need to start digging into that. We can smell the air. We can know fairly quickly if the air smells a bit stale, if it feels a bit humid. We start to look at what the birds are doing, because the birds' activity will tell us what's happening. And then we pick the birds up and we look at the crop fills and we look at the chick condition, and we start to make decisions on potentially what's happening. From here, we start thinking about what's going wrong, how can I fix it and rectify it and get them back on track. So stockmanship for me is key. No matter what generation you're growing, or no matter what part of the grow out you're in, you've got to be able to read your birds and make decisions on what you see. So this is what we would call a good brood setup. So from a PS perspective, we have smaller pens because the populations are smaller. We can't let them half-house brood because they get lost. So we try and have as much paper cover on the floor as possible, which you can see here. We've got feed on floor, we've got feed in the scratch trays, we've got supplementary drinkers, we've got the drinker system also in play. And we've also got a thermometer hanging in the brood area so we can monitor what's going on in the brood pen. From a broiler perspective, obviously, there's a lot more birds, so you don't have as much detail in the small pens, but there's still an opportunity to lay out a lot of paper when you're brooding. And there's probably going to be some people thinking when I go through this, that's going to be too much work, that's going to cost me money. And at the end of the day, that decision is yours because it's your operation. But The old saying, you've got to spend money to make money, and you get out what you put in, very much comes into play when you're brooding. So if you are looking at ways to potentially just tweak a little bit more growth out of them in the 7 days, or a little bit better mortality, then start thinking about things about how much paper am I laying out. You know, another couple of runs of paper, is it really going to make a lot of work for me? What we see here is a great setup, because we've got paper butting up against the pans, whether you put them against or underneath, I have no issues with. It's all about how they transition off the paper to the feeders. So we've got a lot of feed area, and we've also got a lot of drinkers down. So it gives the chicks the ability to have a good start. Okay, brooding temperatures. Now, in my travels, I have a lot of conversations about the brooding temperature, and in our handbooks, whether it's a broiler or the PS, because the chicks are the same when they're placed, we recommend 30 degrees. Now, 30 degrees is based on assumption that you have your humidity sitting at around 50 to 60%. And I have been into farms where I've seen people brooding at 33, 34, 35, even 36 degrees. And the reasons I'm told is because I have low humidity. Okay, that's great, because that means you're understanding the impact that humidity has on the temperature for bird comfort. But the question I need to ask, and I need people to think about, is that if you are in an area that has low humidity, you need to start thinking about trying to increase the shed uniformity before the chicks come in, because we need to keep in mind that the chicks have just come out of a hatcher, and that's about 70, 80% humidity. We're now going to introduce them into an environment where they're going to start growing, and we're going to introduce them into an environment that's got a very low humidity. So what would potentially happen is your birds will start to dehydrate, and they'll also they'll start to back away from the feeder. So when they start, and the other challenge with the low humidity is that you can, when it's very dry, is it can be a bit irritating to the trachea and potentially to the respiratory system. So what we should be doing is, rather than increasing our set point up quite a lot, we should be trying to work out how we can raise our humidity in the shed. Whether that's with a fogger system, whether it's you can get circ fans that have misters on them, whether you can spray the walls if you have old plywood sheds, if you can add a bit of moisture to the floor with a mister on the area that you're not brooding. I haven't talked about cocci vaccines in this program, so if there's any questions at the end about it, humidity in the shed and in the litter is very important for your cycling. So running a very low humidity at the beginning may also impact on that. But just keep in mind that if you do encounter a period of the year where you do have very low humidity outside, try and think of ways you can increase the humidity for the birds, for the chicks as well. Not just by increasing the temperature, but because they do actually need to have that moisture in the air. So as I mentioned, most people I talk to do understand that the difference, how the humidity impacts on the temperature, which is awesome to see. There is a table in our handbooks that most of you may have seen that talks about when your humidity comes up or goes down, you should adjust to these temperatures. Now, for me, for you guys in Australia and New Zealand, there shouldn't really be a need to adjust your temperature because of your humidity increasing. What we need, this table for me, to keep in mind that these handbooks that we have and tables and performance objectives, they're written for a global audience. So we've got to try and capture everyone growing chickens around the world in all sorts of environments and shedding. This table for me is really more for someone who's growing chickens in a tropical environment. So Southeast Asia, for example, where it is constantly hot and humid, even maybe Northern Queensland in the real hot, humid part of the year. But for everyone else, it should be a case of looking at our ventilation. If your humidity is climbing, day 2, day 3, day 4, which it will be because the chicks are adding moisture to the shed now, they're breathing moisture, they're pooping, there's moisture coming out of the drinker system, you should see your humidity starting to climb. But what we need to do, instead of dropping our set point to counteract that, is we should be increasing our minimum ventilation, because we're not taking the moisture out of the shed. Minimum ventilation is a minimum. Don't go underneath it, but by all means feel free to make it longer or increase it if you find that that's what the birds need. So keep that in mind when you start to see the ventilation move, because sometimes what I'm seeing is that we have a great start when we brood, then we get to day 2, day 3, and I'll go into a shed and the birds are quite flat. And I'm going to talk in the next couple of slides about what we see, but keep that in mind. Once you get to 70% humidity, so if you're getting to the late 60s, 70% humidity by day 3, 4, 5, 6, whenever it is, that is your flashing light, your warning, telling you that if you don't correct something in the next day, you're going to start to have litter issues. Once you crack that 70% humidity, there's only one place for it to start accumulating, and that's going to be on your floor. So try and target 50 to 60% and keep in mind maybe increasing the minimum ventilation to remove some of that moisture as you start to go to day 3, 4. But look at the birds, because as I mentioned, the birds are going to tell you what they need. This is going to be our second check. We'll look at the birds first, and then we're going to go and start checking our thermometers and reading our temperatures and looking at our controllers. The other thing I find when humidity is climbing in the shed is that potentially so is the CO2, because as I mentioned, the ventilation's not running enough. They're adding moisture to the shed. They're also adding gases to the sheds, and we're not bringing enough oxygen in and removing those gases. So this is why any service person should have some sort of CO2 meter that they can bring into the shed and check your levels. Ideally, we don't want to be over 3,000 parts per million. Once you hit that 3,000 parts per million, you're going to start to see the birds looking a bit sleepy, not really any activity, quite flat. As I mentioned, you want that humidity around 50 to 60%. And if you've got your minimum ventilation running from the beginning, that's going to help too. And this is also for PS. So PS guys, don't think because you've got less birds, you can ventilate less. You don't have to have it start at the beginning. It's important we have minimum ventilation running no matter how many chicks we've got in the shed. So if our minimum ventilation and also our temperature starts to, our humidity, if some people have humidity sensors, some have CO2 sensors on their controllers. Whatever we're measuring with our controllers and it's running our heaters and our fans, it's important that we're getting the accurate information to that controller. A lot of times when I visit sheds, I'll see probes that are either tied up, they've been moved up out of the way for cleaning and brought back down, but not completely rolled down. And they'll be up in the air reading the temperature up there. And at the end of the day, we want to know what's going on at bird level. So we want to know what's going on right down here, whether it's reading the light level, reading the temperature, the CO2. Your controller needs to be reading the information down here too. So it's important that these probes are either hanging down at bird level or in the brood pen as well. If you have the ability, and a lot of them sometimes have quite a bit of cable and you can see them knotted up like this, the best way to have them is to run them along the roof and then run them down your droppers into your feed line and have them attached just above the feed pipe. This allows you to not have to keep bringing them up and down depending if you brood or grow out. And as the birds outgrow and you lift your feeders up, the probes will move up with them. So you don't have to keep readjusting that. It's always going to be at the right height to give you the right information. But make sure that the controller is getting the correct information in the first place. Now, when we start looking at the chicks and they're telling us they're not happy, there's a few different ways we can see that. So, for example, with hot chicks, what you'll see is the chicks will push out to the side of the pen or they'll push out to the side of the shed. You potentially will see some panting if they're getting really hot, some wings out, some heavy breathing. For me, the first thing I can see is that once they've moved to the side of the sheds, the next step is you'll sometimes start to see them do that. It looks like they're shrugging their shoulders, but what it is they're actually starting to have to breathe harder and harder to try and expel that moisture out. So it's just the precursor to before they're going to get to panting. So when you see that, plus you see them getting pushed out to the walls, it's an indication that they're getting hot. Another sign that can tell you you've had some heat issues or temperature issues or humidity issues that affected the way they feel the temperature is dirty vents. So sometimes you may go into the shed at day 2, 3, 4, and you might see a few birds running around with this, what we call a racing stripe, where they've got a dirty vent, but it's dried and it doesn't smell. If you see birds with vents that are wet and smelly, that's a completely different thing, and you need to talk to your company representative or your vet. But if you're seeing this where it's dry, it's just an indication that at some point they've been overheated, they've started drinking more water, their droppings have got looser, and it's just given them a little bit of a dirty bum. So these are tools that we can take and go, okay, something went wrong, they've been overheated, I'm going to have a look at my numbers, and then next brood, I'm going to readjust, or I'm going to change this when I get to day 2 or day 3. It's an opportunity to improve from run to run. Again, hot chicks out against the walls, and as I mentioned, worst case scenarios, when they start to get extremely hot, is we'll start to see the panting, we'll start to see the wings out, the stretch leg. They're just trying to release heat from their body as best as they can. So we don't want to get to that point. We need to react before we start to see birds like that. Cold chicks, obviously completely different. What you'll see is they'll clump together. They'll clump together for warmth, to keep warm. Gone are the days, and for those people who've been around far too long like me, when we had spot brooders and the chicks could self-regulate. They could go and sit under the brooder when they're cold, and then they could move away from the brooder when they're hot. Because we're heating the air in the shed now, they don't have that ability. So when they get cold, they will come together in groups. But it's important we don't confuse cold chicks and sleeping chicks, because they can look the same from a distance. But when we get closer, what we see with cold chicks is they'll have their heads up and they'll have their eyes open. They'll be alert. Whereas when we have chicks that are sleeping, they will still clump together because it's a comfort thing. But what you will find is that they will have their heads down and their eyes shut. And generally, when we start to see a lot of flat birds sleeping, the first thing I would do is look at how much CO2 I've got in the shed, because that is potentially what's causing them to sleep. It's no different if we were sitting in a room today rather than on a webinar, and I was at the front of the room going blah, 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 and we've got 100 people sitting there and no windows open, and we're all breathing CO2 out. After a while, there'd be a few people who'd start to yawn and then start to slowly fall asleep. So if you see something like this, it's an indication that potentially the CO2 is building and they're being a bit sleepy. I sometimes see this in PS as well. And if I'm confident that the temperature's okay and my ventilation's good and I've got enough oxygen, it could just be a case that I need to give them a little bit of a lights out. What we find with the PS and even with the broilers, is sometimes when you're on 23 hours light, you just need a bit of dark time, and you can flick the lights off, go and have a cup of tea for half an hour, come back, flick the lights on, and then straight away you'll start to hear them running around, you'll start to hear activity at the drinker and the feeder. So again, it's about looking at your birds and making a decision on what needs to improve or change to try and get them back eating, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to stimulate them to eat and drink and eat and drink and sleep, so they can grow and develop at a good rate. So as I mentioned, what we should see when we're looking in the sheds and observing the chicks, we should see some of them eating, some of them should be drinking, some should be playing, some should be talking, some should be sleeping. We should see a little bit of everything. We don't want to see one thing of everything. I don't want to see all the chicks drinking because it tells me there's something wrong. We shouldn't see them all sleeping. We should see a little bit of everything. So this is where your stockmanship kicks in. And this is about letting the birds tell you, all those thousands of thermometers, let them tell you if they're happy and comfortable. Okay, so minimum ventilation, as I mentioned, it's important that we do have it. We don't want any drafts during brooding. We don't want any air movement across the birds. Obviously, the chicks don't have any feathers. They're not very big, and they can't self-regulate. So we need to be able to protect them from any cold areas. Minimum ventilation also allows us to maintain the temperature and humidity, as I mentioned earlier, and we need to remove those gases and moisture and introduce oxygen. So there is a reason why we're running minimum ventilation from the beginning. It's because there has to be a minimum amount of oxygen in, and we need to be taking out what they're adding to the shed. And this is purely up to everyone how they want to run their sheds, particularly in winter. If you do have poor air quality during brooding because you aren't running your minimum ventilation properly, or you've turned your heaters off so you don't have to pay for gas, then there will be consequences, and it's up to you if you want to deal with those consequences. But what we tend to see is when we do have poor air quality in brood is that, there is the potential that you're going to do some damage to the respiratory system and the trachea, which will then leave them a bit susceptible to some respiratory illnesses or problems later on in growth. PS or broiler, it's damaging for both. What happens when we don't have enough air exchange in brood is there's not enough oxygen in the shed, and it tends to lead to ascites. When we see ascites around at 20 days, most of the time we can probably track it back to a lack of oxygen or enough oxygen in the brooding. And we're not removing moisture from the shed. So that's going to lead to potential litter issues, which is then going to lead on to a whole lot of other issues, footpad dermatitis, ammonia levels in the shed. So it is important that we are running our minimum ventilation and that we do understand what we're trying to achieve with it. Airspeed, as I mentioned, should be nothing, but if you do need to check it and you want a number, it's 0.15 meters per second is what the chicks can comfortably live in. Okay, let's talk about feed. So obviously when the chicks come to us, they don't have mother hen there to show them what to eat and what to do. So they don't know what food is. They will pick it like little kids. They'll put anything in their mouth and give it a go. So it's important that we present them the feed where they don't have to go looking for it and they don't go pecking in the litter. So one of the reasons for the paper is for feed area, and another reason is to stop them from eating litter. So broilers, breeders, it's important we have a lot of paper on the floor and that we have a good feed layout on the floor. Fresh and evenly distributed. I don't want to see a big mountain of feed. We don't want to lay our feed out 3-4 days before the chicks arrive. Feed sitting in that 30 degrees or 32 degrees is going to go stale, and it potentially has the potential to also turn a bit rancid. We've got oils and fats in those feeds that in that heat will maybe start turning rancid. What will happen is when the chicks turn up, they'll peck at it. It probably won't taste very nice, and then they'll just peck around it. And again, they're eating, but they're not eating as much as they potentially could because we haven't given them something that's attractive and edible. The more paper you have, the more feed area you have. That's just a no-brainer. As to how much paper you want to lay out is your decision, but keep that in mind when you're trying to get the chicks off to a good start. And ideally, we don't want the chicks traveling very far. So we say we don't want them to travel more than 1 meter from feed and water. We want to be able to get them going in that transition where they eat, drink, and sleeping in between. So you can do it a lot of different ways, obviously. You can lay paper under your pans, against your pans. A lot of broiler sheds now have a system where they can roll the paper out and the feed on top. You know, gone are the days where you have to do it by hand. The breeders obviously don't have that luxury so much, and a lot of it is still done by hand, and there is a lot more attention to detail. So it's just about making sure we're not putting a big heap of feed out that's going to end up in the litter or go stale, and that the birds will be attracted to it. What we find in the breeders that we put a little bit of feed out and we top it up. And the sound of the feed hitting the paper and the smell of the fresh feed is what encourages them back to eat. And that's a principle that can be carried back through to the broilers. Again, it's totally up to you as to what you want to do and how much time you want to spend, but the birds will keep eating if they're getting fresh feed offered to them. What we don't want to see is like virtually nothing, where we've run paper or cardboard out and there's literally nothing there for them to eat, or we get the opposite effect where people have just flooded their pans and flooded their supplementary feeders to then or over piled it, just made a big pile up on the paper that's ended up being scratched out and onto the floor. We don't want to see this because a couple of things are going to happen. They're going to eat the litter because they're going to find the feed in the litter, so you're going to start to get litter eaters. If you do have an issue or comments have been made about litter in the gizzards, then this is potentially where it starts. Because once they start, and that's where they learn to eat, they're just going to keep going back there. The other challenge is if you do flood this and you get a lot of feed on the floor, is they may find it later, and they may find it when you start to do withdrawals. And the last thing you need is the processing plant to give you a phone call to tell you that your birds have got feed and crop. So just keep in mind where you're putting the feed, how much you're putting out, and is it going to end up in the floor. Now, feed form is important, and for all of you, it's out of your control, but it is important that you do monitor your feed as it comes to the farm, and then you can contact your service person, or if you are the service person, you can then have a discussion with the feed mill. Ideally, we want a crumble that's around 2 to 3 mil in size. Obviously, we can't always get what we wish for, but it's important that we do notice when things get quite extreme. So if we get a silo full of dust, obviously that's not going to be good for the chicks, because it's going to take them a lot of time to eat those fines and get that nutrients that they need for that growth. The reverse of that is if we get a particle size that are too big, you're going to have chicks having to select particle sizes they can eat. You could potentially have an issue where they start to form a habit where they start selecting feed and start flicking it on the floor later on as they go through the grow out. And also, again, it's slowing down their growth because they're having to look through and find bits that they can eat, and they're not just consuming what's in front of them. So you can't change how the feed is when it comes to you, but it is important that you do know what is acceptable and what's not acceptable, and then talk to someone about that. Transitioning from the feed, from your brooding to your feed system is important. So what I see a lot of times is that most people do have a great brood set up, but a lot of the times the transition from day 2, day 3, whether it's environmental, like I talked about with increasing humidity, or when it's transferring onto the feed system, sometimes the feeders aren't as accessible to the chicks as the paper was. The feed's now gone off the paper. They have to start finding the feed in the feed pans. There's a lot of different pans out there. We've got new sheds in the system. We've got very old sheds out there. We've got all sorts of different pans. Some are new, some are 20 years old. Whatever pan system you're using, just make sure that the lip isn't too high that does impede how the chick can get to that feed. we want to see an easy transition from the feed paper to the feed pan where there's no stop and start. We don't want any of the stop and start on their nutrition. We want to just keep that going to keep everything developing. So if you do have pans that are quite deep, then potentially think about, maybe do I need to semi-bury them? Do I need to push the shavings around? Just think of the ways that the chick needs to be able to transition onto that feed system and keep going. Okay, let's talk about water. So as we all know, that chickens are 60 to 75% water. Water works as a feed lubricant, so it's very important for the digesting of the feed once they eat it, and then obviously transporting it through the gut. Now, if your chickens can't drink, they're not going to eat. Simple as that. They're not going to eat and then maybe drink a little bit and go back and eat. If they can't get the water they need, then that's it. All bets are off on the feeding system. So it's really important that we do understand and we do have the best water availability for the chicks as they come into the shed. Water is also important for them to help regulate their temperatures. As I mentioned, with those dirty bums, if it gets hot, they will drink more water to help cool down. We know they don't sweat, that pant, so that's how they're going to, initially, how they're going to try and lose that heat. Ideally, use a supplementary drinker in your brood. Again, I don't really see any broiler guys do this, but it's not to say you can't. It's definitely something that's used in the PS system, as seen in the pictures. It just, again, gives the chickens more places to find water to then go back to the feed while they're learning the nipple system. With the nipple system, you're looking at about 12 chicks per nipple. So make sure you do have enough nipples in that brood area for the amount of chicks that you're placing. Ideally, your water wants to be around that 18 to 21 degrees in temperature. Don't give cold water to cold chicks. So if you are flushing your lines, for example, and it's 0 degrees outside and you're pulling your water out of the ground, think about what temperature it is coming into the shed. We don't give babies cold milk for the same reason we don't give chicks cold water. Best case scenario, if you give them cold water, is they're just going to be a bit chilled. They're going to back away from everything, look a bit miserable while they warm back up. Worst case scenario, if you give the chicks cold water, is that you're going to kill them. You're going to chill them from the inside out. This, again, is probably more for those who are using supplementary drinkers, where you do fill up your holding bins from a tap. Just make sure that water has an opportunity to warm up before you start adding it back into the supplementary drinkers. But as I mentioned, on the opposite side, when we are in summertime and you've got 30 degrees in the shed, it is a good idea to flush the drinkers just prior to arrival, just to try and bring that water temperature down, because obviously the water sitting in that pipe would have got up to that temperature. Daily, if you want to, for the first few days, to just, again, try and bring that temperature down a little bit so that the birds are feeling it a little bit, they're getting a bit more of that cooler water to cool down. And for everyone, no matter what country you're in or where you're growing your chickens, you should be treating your water. In Australia, I know there's places where they are pulling water off dams. So it's important that we're chlorinating it, or some sort of water treatment system where we can kill any pathogens and bugs, and ensure that the water we're bringing into the birds is as clean as possible. Now, nipple height. Now, this is another one that I see a little bit of too. Don't be in a hurry to lift your nipples up. Again, they need to find the nipple, they need to learn from the nipple, and then they need to be able to get back to the nipple for the first few days while they're learning the whole layout of the shed. If they can't access water, they won't eat. So again, sometimes you see challenges or the slowdown of body weight gains happen at day 2, 3, 4, and this is another reason why. It's because we've started to lift the nipple line and we've lifted it a bit too high. We want it at eye height. Sorry, I should have said this here. We want for the first 7 days, we want the eye at level with the nipple, so they can see the nipple, they can play with it, activate it, and start drinking from it. What I don't like seeing is when the nipples have started to be raised and they're only like day 1, day 2, and we've started lifting them up because we're worried about water wastage on the floor. Most people have drip trays on their nipples, and these are actually in the way for the chick when you start lifting that up. So just keep that in mind, that until they get a little bit bigger and they can maneuver around those drip trays a bit easier, these drip trays are actually going to interfere with how they can access those nipples. So when we start to get these going up at day 2, 3, 4, there are chances that some of the smaller chicks will start struggling to reach these nipples because they can't reach past these drip trays to access them. What we want to see is the nipple at eye level. this one here. We want the chick to be able to see the nipple, see the potentially a little drop of water on the nipple, and then start tapping at it and understanding that's where the water source is. Again, this is what we want to see. Right at eye level, not too low, and not too high either, so they can easily, and they can also learn from each other, because they'll be standing there watching the other chicks tapping at it, and then they'll start tapping at it. So it's all about teaching each other as well. The other thing is we should be priming our nipples before our chicks arrive. There is no flashing light on top of the drinker line that says water here, come and get it. We need to attract them to that drinker line to understand where the water's from, and they need to see the water. So when you prime your nipples before the birds arrive, hopefully there will be water. They can see the water glistening on the nipple, or they can see maybe a drop, and there may be a little bit of water in the drip tray. I don't like it when I go to placements and no one's, they've just brought the drinker line down. There's no water in the nipple, there's no water in the tray, and potentially sometimes there's even not water all the way down the shed. So make sure you have water available for the chicks, because as I mentioned, if they can't have water, they're not going to eat. And again, these little things can slow down that start, that can then impact on what you're trying to achieve at 7 days. Water quality, I'm sure you've all got standards for the companies that you grow for. Your pH levels should be around 5 to 8. Look at things like your hardness, your iron levels. You know, the temperature is something you can keep an eye on. Chlorination of some sort, whether it's chlorine dioxide or free chlorine. Some people have reverse osmosis. As long as you know what your numbers should be and that you're checking them regularly. What we can do and what everyone should have is some sort of testing kit on farm. Obviously, your service people will maybe have something a bit more detailed, but as a grower or a farm manager, you should have some sort of kit that you can go to the nipple, and you should be taking your samples at the nipple, not outside, not wherever. We want to take it where the chick's drinking, and we can regularly check if we're getting the correct chlorine levels that we're after. When we start to see these levels not reaching where they should be, and we know the chlorine dosing is correct and that it's going into the system, then we need to start figuring out potentially what's causing that chlorine to drop away. And is there it could be some sort of contamination in the system. Do we need to start looking at our cleaning? Do we need to look at our header tanks? You know, when we really start digging down, we do spend a lot of time cleaning our drinker lines, but then we need to start thinking about our regulators, as I mentioned, filters, holding tanks, just to see if we've got the cleanest possible water coming through. Okay, so what will happen when the chicks don't start well? You know, sometimes we don't get a good start. You know, that just happens. That does happen. Our best intentions can sometimes we just don't get the start we were hoping for. So chicks that don't start well can be susceptible to things like disease challenges and health problems, like I mentioned. It's going to compromise their weight gain. They don't have that great villi development and a nice, strong, healthy gut, then it's going to also potentially give you a poor FCR. They don't cope as well with environmental stresses, whether it's heat, density, that sort of thing. You could potentially see some mortality issues. And one of the big things too is your evenness into the plant, or your uniformity in your PS birds. So what you do at the beginning is going to impact on that uniformity going forward. In a broiler farm, you're not going to correct that uniformity as you grow out. The guys in the breeders, if they aren't getting their uniformities, good uniformities, shed uniformities at week 4, then they're going to be doing full shed grades. And for this, these guys spend a lot of time manhandling their birds. When they've got to do full shed grades, they've got to weigh every single bird in the shed individually and decide if they're going to be a small, medium, and large, and then place them in a pen to feed them differently. It's important we have uniform birds going into the processing plant. So if we are having complaints from processing about our uniformity, then potentially we need to go back and make sure that all our chicks got a good start. Did I have mixed donor flocks? Did I look after the little chicks a little bit more than the others to make sure they got up and going just as well as the other ones? Just go back and start troubleshooting and trying to think where I can potentially make changes to improve that going forward. There's a few checks we can do to see if we have hit our targets. Vent temperatures on arrival, that's something that we should be doing on the PS farms. There's no reason why you can't be doing it at the broiler level. Crop fill results, which I'll go through in a minute. We have our targets that we want to achieve at 7 days. From a PS perspective, we talk about our body weights. We want to achieve our body weights at 7 days. The female target is 120. So, you know, we want our butcher females to be around 120 to 130 grams. The broilers, It's important we talk more about ratios than body weights, because your body weight's going to be dependent on your starting weight. And your starting weight is going to can vary from a code 1 to a chick that's come from a, say, a 28-week-old donor flock to something a code 3 that's potentially 60 weeks. The ratio gives you a better comparison. So what you do is you take your 7-day weight and divide it by your day-old weight. In New Zealand, we should be achieving 4.8, and I know a lot of people are, even cracking into the 5s. In Australia, it's a little bit lower, but we should still be trying to hit that 4.5. And if we're not, and I know there's people out there probably sitting there going, no, I'm not, then we need to start looking back at our records, looking back on our previous batches and go, and stuff I've talked about today, and then go, maybe I'm going to do that different. Maybe I'm going to revisit my moisture in the shed, and determine if I should be increasing my minimum ventilation and not decreasing the temperature. So it's a case of just revisiting these things to see if we can improve our performance. 7-day mortality figures, if we've got health issues or we've had a bad start because of chick quality, it's going to show up in our mortality figures. And for PS, we're also measuring our uniformity. So we do expect to lose uniformity from day old to 7 days in the PS, but it's how much uniformity we lose is the question. We shouldn't see a big drop in uniformity of, say, 15, 20% in the first 7 days. That then tells us we haven't had a good brood. So make sure you do study your figures and you do look at these numbers, because that will help you make decisions on your next run to see if you can make some improvements. Vent temperature, we have a how-to on vent temperature. There's thermal neutral zone is 39.4 to 40.5. If you don't have a broiler thermometer, if you're in the broiler system, it's a really simple way to check your chicks on arrival. Put their feet up against your face. If they've got cold feet, then they're cold. And obviously you can identify a hot chick coming off a truck because it'll be panting. But from a PS point of view, definitely dig out the how-to and try and take some vent temps on arrival. Crop fill, which everyone should be doing, gives us a really good quick indication if there has been a good start. We can identify any issues up front really quick within 8 to 24 hours. So we should be picking up our chicks after 8 hours, and we're targeting at least 80% of the birds, chicks we pick up have some feed and water in their crops. 24 hours, we're expecting at least 95%. If we're not achieving those numbers, this is the time we can correct it and get them back on track before it becomes a problem. I would do crop fill test again around day 2, day 3, when they've transitioned off the paper and are permanently on the feed system, just to make sure everyone's getting the food and water. I'm not too worried about this one's got a really tight full crop, this one's only got a half full crop. It's just about making sure they are eating, because you are going to pick up birds who have maybe been having a snooze or have just been taking a time out, versus a chick who's just been hard out eating and has quite a full crop. So it's about feeling the feed and water in the crop versus an empty crop. An empty crop, it feels like a balloon, a deflated balloon. It'll just be nothing, absolutely nothing. If you're getting a few of those, then straight away it should be raising a flag for you to say that something's not right and I've got to fix it real quick. Okay, so in summary, shed preparation is important to ensure a good start. As I mentioned, it's like the perfect storm. You can't have the best floor temperature but the wrong air temperature, or you can't have the best floor and air temperature but not enough feed out on paper. So keep in mind those things all need to be lined up together so that when the chicks arrive, they hit the floor running and they're happy and they're off they go. We want to develop an appetite and drinking behaviour quickly. As I mentioned, there's a lot of growth and development going on with those chicks as we start them off, particularly in the gut. It's really important that we do kickstart that gut growth and get those villi growing nice and long. So we want to develop that appetite, but then we want to maintain it. So get them going well with placement, but then make sure they transition well into your feed system. Chick observation is by far the most important thing you can do. Stockmanship is for me, is a no-brainer. Do not get focused on what your controller's saying. Do not let the controller tell you how the shed should be run. As I've said, you've got thousands of thermometers in the shed. Go in and look at them, and then you tell the controller what it needs to do. Because as soon as the controller is making the decisions based on probes that aren't potentially in the right place or aren't actually reading correctly, then you're going to have some issues with what you think is right versus what is actually happening in the shed. So make sure you do observe the chicks and get in there, have a look, smell the air, and then make some decisions about potentially what you need to change to get them comfortable in eating. Temperature, humidity, and CO2 monitoring, all very important. As I mentioned, don't rely on the controllers to do everything for you. You're just going to have some issues. You can't beat human observation, and you can't beat using the tools attached to your body. So don't be afraid to make some changes, whether it's to increase your humidity by adding some moisture to the shed, to increase your minimum ventilation to remove some of the moisture from the shed, and bring in oxygen. But make sure you are monitoring these things and that you do understand what needs changing. As I mentioned, don't neglect the ventilation. That's a lot of the times what I see is potentially it's not running correctly, and this is what's putting the birds off the feed. If you've got flat birds, and it could be that they're feeling hot or there's not enough fresh air in the shed. Do your tests, do your checks, and make sure the birds are tracking well. So crop fill tests, as I mentioned, the 7-day weights, the mortality, keep these figures and make sure you do look at them and then review them for the next run. We're always learning. Everyone in this industry is always learning. We're taking what we learn and trying to implement it into the next shed. And it may be that something I've said today, you might be sitting there going, oh, I don't know about that. Just try it in one shed. That's all I say. Just try something in one shed and see if it makes any difference. A poor start cannot be corrected in the grow out. Don't think for a minute that if you have a poor start, you're going to gain it later on down the track. Like I mentioned, if we don't start them off growing them well, getting that gut development going, keeping them nice and healthy, it's going to impact all the way down. You may have a cocci challenge of some sort, and it's because it could potentially be because your gut hasn't been developed nice and strong to battle it. You know, the litter's turned because we had too much humidity in the shed, so now we've got foot pad problems. So just keep that in mind. Same with the breeders, you know. For breeders, the challenges are uniformity. The breeders are there, you guys are there to grow birds all the same. They're on a daily feed rate. We need them to eat that daily amount that we put out for them, grow at the same rate, and then be ready for that sexual maturity. So it's very much about uniformity for the PS, and what you do in the very beginning is going to impact on how they track through that rearing phase. As I mentioned, a poor start can lead to all sorts of health issues. So gut integrity is what I've focused on today, but for you guys, that's going to give you the best chance of getting good growth out of the birds. You can look at the droppings on the floor as they go along and things like that, and that will tell you if there's any issues with the gut. But give them a good start to build a strong, healthy gut that can face some challenges when they come across them. And that, I think, is it. Thank you. Back to you, Rochelle.